Good morning.
Morning. Good morning. Look at this room.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited for this conversation, and I'm grateful to share the stage with Heather McGhee, someone I have admired in many respects. I'm also excited because the core idea of Heather's book, The Sum of Us, is what has animated my work at McKinsey. McKinsey founded its Institute for Black Economic Mobility in 2020 with the idea that if you expanded opportunity for Black Americans, our entire economy would be bigger, stronger, and more dynamic. And the research bears this out, so let me just share a few statistics. We know that Black folks are actually more entrepreneurial than almost any other group, but the businesses that they start are subscale and not aligned to the industries that are going to be fastest growing in the future. But if Black businesses were at the same scale as white businesses, and if they were aligned to the specific industries that are going to be fastest growing, it would mean $1.6 trillion of additional revenue for those businesses on an annual basis. We know that Black households are more likely to be in what we call consumer and food deserts, places that don't have access to high quality goods, high quality services, and high quality food. But if Black Americans had their needs met, it would unleash $300 billion in additional spending. We know that there's a large life expectancy gap between Black Americans and white Americans that has since expanded because of the COVID crisis. Today, the average Black American dies 6 years sooner than the average white American. If we closed that life expectancy gap, that would mean 3.3 million more Black Americans alive today. These are people who would be contributing to their local economies and contributing to our broader society. And we know that there is a large, substantial racial wealth gap that has existed for generations. And for many years, it has been growing, not shrinking. But if we close this racial wealth gap, it would actually unleash our entire economy. Across Black and Latino households, if the racial wealth gap was closed, our economy would be $3 trillion larger on an annual GDP basis. So Heather, despite this evidence, despite the data that shows we actually have a lot more to gain together than we do apart, there's still a narrative of the zero-sum game. A narrative that for many white Americans that their success is rooted in Black Americans' economic failure. You've traveled across the country and explored this idea. Tell us what you saw and why is this zero-sum game so difficult for us as a country and for policymakers and people alike to get rid of?
Well, first of all, I do want to say just such a huge fan of your work. Thank you for the contribution of the entire Institute and the landmark report that really did set the agenda and shift the debate. And I'm just so happy to be here and so happy that this summit is happening, BEA. Listen, everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And so when we ask questions like, where is this economically unsound, yet culturally resonant, zero-sum story coming from, we have to ask who's telling this story. Who's selling this story? How are they profiting from the sale of this story, economically and politically? And that's where, in the research that I did for The Sum of Us, I had to look back in history to figure out where this story even came from and remember that stories justify ends, and it was the greed that was the end, and the racism was the justification for the greed, right? And then now we have this reanimation of the zero-sum story at a time of demographic change that has lots of different names for it: the Great Replacement Theory, us versus them, winners and losers, makers and takers. It has become the core political narrative to cohere an economic agenda. And that economic agenda is redistributing wealth upwards and keeping power and wealth concentrated in a narrow set of hands. It is privileging short-term over long-term. It is privileging the next quarter's profits over the next generation. And so I think this room is particularly well suited to be able to challenge that narrative and, dare I say, challenge what in some ways are like known individuals who are holding those megaphones. And when we look at our cable media, our news media, our political media, as well as our social media, and we do an analysis of what are the core narratives that are the most amplified, the zero sum is highly, highly saturated and broadcast, marketed. It has more technological sophistication than it's ever had behind it, right? Between the social media algorithms that engender outrage and hate for profit, and of course, the political agenda where this really, even more than an economic coherence, which I think we're not seeing from our political parties as much, right now, the real story of the debate is whether the shifting demographics of America are the fulfillment of this country's promise or are the unmaking of it. And so we've got to go to the source, right? We've got to choke off the supply of that zero-sum story.
Yeah. Interesting that the source of the zero-sum story. In your book, you started with the history of this country and how the country was founded, from the stripping of lands from indigenous people to chattel slavery itself. Now, I do a lot of work in education, and you just adapted the Sum of Us for young readers. We were talking backstage that this is really meant for middle to high school. Yeah. Can you talk to us about why it was important to adapt the Sum of Us for young readers, especially at this moment where the content that young folks are being taught is actually being constrained relative to the history of our country rather than expanded?
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to adapt the Sum of Us for young readers because when adults read it, they would tell me, I wish I'd known this earlier. And I felt, as I was writing it, I wish I'd known this earlier. And today's young people, they're already living in the nation that's becoming, right? They're already in the generation that has no dominant racial majority. So they really need to figure out, is it us versus them? How did we get into this place? What are the roots of our dysfunction? And they're obviously not getting, a great coherent story about this from, our general political debate. And they're not getting it in education, right? In 2018, less than 10% of high school seniors could accurately name slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. 10%, y'all. That's where we're starting from, right? So when we talk about this entire debate about DEI and CRT and SEL and this alphabet soup of, this progressive education is, hello?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
So that's where we're starting from. And so this narrow window of raised consciousness brought to us by the deaths and the murders and the movement building that followed is really trying to sabotage something that is being built, which is a durable, multiracial, anti-racist majority in this country, led by young people. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been traveling around the country, going to schools, high schools, middle schools, public libraries, school libraries, with the Sum of Us young readers. And I'm here to tell you the kids are all right, right? Whether it is a, white suburban school, Quaker school, or an inner city public school, or a charter school. Like, I've been everywhere, Catholic schools. And first of all, my book is not an unsophisticated book, right? It is a book about the economic history of this country that talks about redlining and discrimination. There's a whole chapter on the financial crisis, and they get it. They truly get it. The questions they're asking are so sophisticated. And here's what the research tells us about the way young people interact with this kind of text. Students of color who read more sort of fuller accounts of history that focuses on, social movements and social change, feel more empowered in the classroom, show higher critical thinking skills, see themselves and feel more empowered to make change. And white students, contrary to the fears, the ginned up fears, are not feeling guilty because they're like, this wasn't me. You know what I'm saying? Like, that is the parents' guilt, right? Mm-hmm. That is not these young people's guilt. They actually feel more empathy more positive feelings about Black and brown people, and more, again, empowered to make change. And so that is the result that is being feared by those very same people who are telling a zero-sum story about our history, about Black history versus American history. And ultimately, again, we've got to look for the economic rationale, right? Yeah. We've got to look at how this is drained pool politics as well, right? So in the central metaphor in The Sum of Us is the story of how the grand era of lavishly funded public swimming pools, and I use that as a metaphor for all kinds of public goods in the New Deal era. Obviously, economic public goods are more significant to me, but how that era came to a screeching halt in the era of public pool integration, right? And once the segregated pools were integrated, many towns and cities, not just in the South, drained their public pools. And it's how the consciousness of racial difference undercuts our ability to see collective action, public goods, massive investments in one another as the way forward. And there was a radical shift in our history when the public really began to mean all of the public. And so I think today, when we look at who's driving this chaos machine that is making librarians have to take off their books and answer to cranks who are sending requests and challenges about, board books, that is trying to create chaos and flight from our last integrated public goods, right? These schools and these libraries. And trying, frankly, to create another profit center in these areas. And I think we have to be very vigilant and remember, it's not popular. We have a way in this country of focusing on the worst, right? The media absolutely incentivizes it. If it leads, if it bleeds, it leads. Social media, we've already talked about that algorithm. And so you would have us think that half the country wanted to ban a book by Ruby Bridges, right? That's what the media would have us think. That is not true, right? 88% of the country thinks there is no way, no circumstance under which a book about race and racism should be banned. 88% of the country. In Florida, it's highly unpopular, supermajority unpopular, this agenda to challenge public schools and universities and remake them in an ideological image. And so we've got to remember that this consciousness raising is so powerful, and that's why it's being attacked.
Yeah. And I love the point of the starting point. The media would have you believe that there's all of this advantage on the side of Black Americans and underrepresented Americans, but we're actually starting from a place of significant underrepresentation and disadvantage. And then we are trying to push back that progress even further. That's so right. I appreciate that, that grounding. In a room of public sector leaders, private sector leaders, social sector leaders, media leaders, especially given your work at Color of Change, just interested in guidance you would give this group, based on your travels across the country of things that have worked or things that have given you hope on places or initiatives or things that they should focus on to really shift the narrative that instead of us being competitors, we actually have more to gain from working with each other.
Well, I'd say a few things. The first is that there is still widespread discrimination in our financial markets and in our business practices today. And I think it's really important to know the history, right? Really important to know the economic and racial history of this country. It's foundational, even if you are not someone who cares about or is involved in understanding the wealth and economic situation today of people of color. It just is, you have to know it to understand the market in this country, right? The history matters, but so do the numbers of the Black homeowners who were able to refinance during the refinancing boom of the last couple of years, right? So does the practices in the underwriting and the insurance markets today, right? So does the very recent history of the lack of accountability still for the tremendous theft of wealth that happened through subprime mortgage lending and predatory mortgage lending, right? And so we need to really understand the ways in which continual discrimination today still plays a role. And I think there's a role for many of the people in this room who are within industries that really enjoy being able to talk about equity and yet still have algorithms and practices that are stripping wealth today. Right? We need to challenge the home appraisal industry.
Yep.
I was at a school and a young Black woman, a 15-year-old, raised her hand and talked about how last week her parents had done an experiment with their home mortgage appraisal for a refinance, right? And had their parents' white friends sit in the room while the appraisal was happening, and there was a $300,000 difference between the appraisals. This was last week. This was a 15-year-old, right? So I think we can't leave that low-hanging fruit, unplucked and unchallenged. It also helps with the narrative.
Yeah.
Because when we only think about historical legacy of discrimination, then it feels like the problem is solved, and now any race consciousness is further discrimination. I think we need a true racial reckoning around asset building and home ownership in this country. And in an economy where the average Black college graduate has less wealth than the average white high school dropout, I actually don't see how we get to where we need to go, to where that Black college graduate can have a return on her hard work without some sort of reparations. I just don't see it. I don't see the math. I don't see the math because we all know in this room, and your colleagues know, how powerful wealth is. And I'm not talking about a safe deposit box with jewels in it. I'm talking about a little bit of household wealth. And that being the difference between being able to start a business or being able to service debt with the first 10 years of your life. And we all know that, right? And I just don't see how we're getting there without a real Marshall Plan for Black wealth in America. And I think the kinds of decisions that we're looking at right now around student loan debt cancellation, around affirmative action, around what is going on with the sort of anti-poverty agenda, period, and us taking a foot off the gas and the historic nearly 50% reduction in poverty that happened during the pandemic from 2018 to 2022, we've got to keep our foot on the gas and we've got to stay focused. Not just for our people, but for the future of this country, for the fact that we've got to be at the front lines of change around the economic transformation that needs to happen on climate change, right? We can't look at the report from yesterday from the IPCC and say that we don't need to be race conscious, wealth conscious, and solutions oriented, and that fundamentally, as much as there is a role for the private sector in spurring innovation, we have got to continue to use our voices to call for collective solutions. We're not going to get where we need to get on wealth, on climate, on democracy, on education, without collective solutions. And it's that zero-sum lie that has always been the Achilles heel of our ability to come together in this country and plan big things and win big things for all of us, no matter what we look like or where we come from.
Amazing. Well, Heather, I know we're getting short on time. Any additional remarks? Or
I want to ask you a question. Is that okay?
All right, please.
We have 1 minute and 50 seconds.
Okay.
All right. You are a partner at McKinsey. You have been leading this work within the firm. What do you think needs to happen?
Yeah.
For this audience?
Yeah. So I'd say two things. One is we need to rethink the sectors who are involved in Black economic mobility. I think too much is put on the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, and not enough is put on particularly the private sector. I think people are excited about the boards that they're on and the donations that they give, but to your point, aren't looking hard enough at their business practices that are expanding the racial wealth gap and that are pushing Black Americans back every single day. So like more in the private sector in terms of everyday business, doing better for Black Americans, and I think less emphasis on donations and philanthropic contributions towards nonprofits. I think the second is scale. So if you look at the conversation within the private sector, what I see is great initiatives that are very small scale. We have a significant problem in this overall country. I think we need to move at a scale that is commensurate to that problem. It's not going to be sufficient to give a couple of scholarships to 1 to 2 students. It's not going to be sufficient to have a couple of high school kids have internships, right? We have to have significant problems that match the scale of significant solutions that match the scale of the problem, and we need to do that at pace. And so I think that's the things that I think we're trying to push through our institute and the guidance I would give to this group. Heather McGhee, thank you so much.
Duwain Pinder, thank you. Thank you.